Hello, this is the Skeptical Jelly Bean from the jar, and today I thought I'd start a series on the things that atheists and theists tend to get wrong in debates. This episode will be about the burden of proof, which is a key part of epistemological debate. Now, I'm not going to be getting into arguments for or against theism, but I am going to point out some mistakes that I tend to see atheists make when they're having conversations with theists about whether or not a god exists. These mistakes are extremely easy to make, especially if you've only looked into the subject a tiny bit. But after you dig a bit deeper, it becomes apparent that some atheists aren't really applying sound epistemology like they're expecting theists to do. Let's go ahead and get into it. My biggest pet peeve in the debate about whether or not a god exists is the burden of proof. People on both sides misunderstand, misrepresent, and try to shift the burden of proof. To help explain burden of proof, I like to use an analogy that involves a jar of jelly beans. Imagine that you and I are walking down the street and we come upon a jar of jelly beans. Neither of us has seen this jar before, so we don't really know that much about it. What we do know is that it has some number of jelly beans inside it that is either even or odd. If I assert that the number of jelly beans in the jar is even, I adopt burden of proof for that claim, which I would then meet by counting the jelly beans. If you assert that the number of jelly beans in the jar is odd, you accept a burden of proof for that claim as well. The only position that does not include a burden of proof is the lack of a claim, which would basically be I'm not convinced that either claim is true. Convince me of the truth of your claim. Basically, if you make a claim and you want to convince anyone that the claim is true, or you want to be justified in accepting the claim, you adopt a burden of proof. Let's use the same example, but change a few labels. Imagine that you and I are walking down the street and we come upon reality. Neither of us know whether or not a god exists in this reality, but we know that it's true because it's a binary proposition that either a god exists or that a god does not exist in this reality. If you claim that a god exists, you adopt a burden of proof. If you claim that no gods exist in this reality, then you also adopt a burden of proof. The only position that lacks a burden of proof is the lack of acceptance of either position. I've seen both atheists and theists try to reverse the burden of proof and say, I don't have to prove my claim, you have to convince me that your claim is true, which isn't the case if you are in fact asserting a claim. If you want to convince someone of something, or if you want to be justified in believing something, you have to demonstrate that the claim that you're making is true. I personally was confused about this for a while, but then I started to understand when I realized that the thing that makes one take on a burden of proof isn't what claim the person makes, it's whether or not the person is making a claim. Some people respond to this by saying something like, we're justified in believing that unicorns don't exist without having to prove it. To which I would respond that you do, actually. It's just so easy to prove that unicorns don't exist on Earth that you've done it without even realizing it. Now, you may have heard the phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and this is often true. However, if we would expect to see evidence of something under some set of circumstances, then the absence of evidence is, in fact, evidence of absence. If someone claims that my house was flooded, and I go inside and see that there's not a drop of water on the floor, and everything is right where I left it, completely undamaged, then, because of the lack of evidence of a flood, I can conclude that there was no flood. Sure, it's possible that the flood happened, but a secret flood cleanup crew came in and repaired and replaced everything. But that's a violation of Occam's razor, which I'm going to get into in another video, and that's a claim that would have to be demonstrated. Basically, unicorns, as physical animals, would leave some trace of themselves behind. Since unicorns are large animals, we would definitely expect to see evidence of their existence. We don't see any unicorn skeletons, and we don't see any unicorns out in the wild, so unicorns probably don't exist. If you assert that unicorns don't exist, you do adopt a burden of proof. It's just laughably easy to meet. Unicorns are large animals, and we would probably see evidence of them exist. We don't see any evidence that they exist, so they probably don't exist. There's a version of this that applies to a god called the argument from divine hiddenness, but I'll explain that in another video. Basically, if you make a claim and you want to be justified in accepting that claim, then you have to meet your burden of proof. It's not up to someone to prove you're wrong. It's your job to prove yourself right. And on that note, I think that concludes this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoy my content, consider liking and subscribing. If you have any suggestions for video topics or for videos that I can respond to, feel free to comment down below. I'll see you next time. Toodles!